Hello everyone, welcome to another video. So today I would like to discuss about pop music for music therapists, but how to understand the pop music considering the different periods of time since the 50s. So the idea is that we can understand what happened with the music, especially in the mass media music, and what were the differences considering the different decades. So I will start for sure as we heard in the last video. So if you didn't watch the first video, so please you have in this YouTube channel. So in the last video I talked about that the pop music started in the mid 50s in a movement that people started with this idea of having music that people they can consume. And if we start this in the 50s, it's important that we can see the evolution of these different tendencies and these different things. It's interesting to say that the researchers who work to study specifically pop music, they use especially the model of the evolutionary biology, because they really believe that understanding the biology perspectives to understand how people they consume music, we have a lot of similarities, and this is a nice model to understand how we have these different things. So if we start in the 50s, and I have here for sure every time I look at the things, if we consider the 50s, what was pop music? I need to consider many artists. So for instance, the top one was Elvis Presley, but we have as well Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, Little Richards, the Everly Brothers, Bill Harley and the Comets, Ray Charles. So many artists that they were pop music. For sure, as we saw in the last video, so pop music is a diverse range of genres that I can classify as a pop. So I can say that in the 50s, yes, so pop music was especially related with rock and with the rhythm and blues that normally we call R&B. Yes, so this in the 50s. So in the 60s we have something different, because in the 60s we have, especially, I just want to take here one example for you. So just to give you an idea about that, some of the artists. So exactly, we started to have in the 60s more artists like the Beatles. So we start to have, for instance, I just want to open here to be sure what I'm saying. Yes, so Elvis Presley, Bee Gees, Cher, The Doors, Pink Floyd. So especially in this period in the 60s, with all this influence from Beatles and from Rolling Stones, they were in some ways the biggest artists. And it's interesting because even when people they say about Beatles, they say, well, Beatles is pop music. Yes, and especially in the 60s, they were so important. And it's interesting because in some ways we have this different understanding about what people are listening. So in the 60s we had, for sure, we continue with this, a lot of influence from the rock and roll in the 60s. So just some more artists for you here, because it's important to see that if we consider what was important in one decade, we can understand more about the different styles. So as well, it's important to consider in the 60s other artists like James Brown, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley for sure, Sam Cooke, Jimi Hendrix. So this was the pop music in the 60s. So in some ways I can say that the funk, and so in some ways had a lot of influence in the pop music. I can say, remember, in this video I'm just talking about the international perspectives. For sure you need to check in your country the differences that you have. So in the 60s we had as well Bob Dylan, so we have this influence as well about the folk music in some way. So this was the pop music in the 60s. So something really interesting. And in the 70s actually, we have something different, because in the 70s, when we see the different artists that they were popular, just to see what was the pop music in this period, we have, for instance, Steve Wonder, Led Zeppelin, Elton John, the Rolling Stones, Eagles, Marvin Gaye, Queen, James Brown, and The Who. Yes, so in some ways, I can say here we continue with the rock and roll, we continue with the funk, we continue as well with the rhythm and blues. So in some ways, the main difference in the 70s, that we have bands like ABBA, Bee Gees, that we start having this a kind of a disco movement. So it's so important that we can understand that even that we continue with the styles from the 60s, we have more, especially the hard rock with bands like Led Zeppelin, you have Kiss, and for sure you have other things like ABBA, Bee Gees, and different things. So it's a period that we maintain some things, but we added new things in the 70s. In the 80s, with this a lot of influence from, from the beats, the electronic beats, the electronic effects. So we started to have more other genres. But this in the 80s, it's an important period for the hard rock, like bands like Van Halen, Bon Jovi. So you start to have more this in a popular way. It's so interesting. So, but we have as well I can say that the biggest triangle in the 80s. You have Michael Jackson, you have Prince, and you have Madonna. This artist is considered nowadays as a kind of legends, because they were so important, because they stayed during the top 10 during the whole 80s. So these artists, they were so important. And for sure, we start to have a lot of influence as well in terms of the rock and roll and hard rock, because we had more, for instance, the Guns N' Roses started in this period. So a lot of this movement of the bands playing rock and roll, this was so popular, but especially the hard rock. And as well, in many heavy metal bands, they were so popular in the 80s. So it's interesting to think about that. The rock and roll was part of the pop music in the 80s and in the 70s. This is so important, not the classical rock and roll, but more the hard rock and even some bands of heavy metal. So this is important to consider. And for sure, if we go to the 90s, we have many things. We continue with the rock and roll, because we had bands, especially in the grunge movement, and for sure, like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, bands like this. You had a lot of influence as well, because in the 90s, when you start having the things from the hip hop, so in a way you have Dr. Dre, you have Tupac, and all these things from the hip hop. You start to have Puff Daddy, all these artists. But in a way, in the 90s, you still continue with some other styles that they were popular in some years ago, but they return with a kind of a strong movement. And this is that people, they call the contemporary R&B. So because you have the classical rhythm and blues, but if you look to the contemporary, specifically R&B, you have something different, because you have more the influence not only from the blues for sure and the funk, but here you start having the influence from the hip hop. You started having influence from the electronic music, and this is important because this created something that even nowadays we have so important. So this movement of hearing R&B but in a more contemporary way. So for instance, Mariah Carey was one of the first that started with this perspective, and we had a lot of bands in this perspective, so I can include as well Spice Girls and other groups in this perspective, especially in this way of doing rhythm and blues but a more contemporary way. Okay, so this was in the 90s, and remember that in the 90s we had all the boys bands, and the boys bands, you can as well classify them especially in this a kind of R&B style with some influences from, as I said, from the hip hop, from the other styles, so in a more new version considering the artists from the R&B in the past. Okay, and now we start going to the 2000s, if I can say like that. So from 2000 to 2010, we still had this strong influence from the hip hop and this new R&B. So many hip hop artists like Eminem and others like Jay-Z, but you still have this influence from this new R&B with Britney Spears, Maroon 5, Mariah Carey, Christina Aguilera, and all of these different things. I will put as well in the description of this video one video that is amazing called Best Selling Music Artists from 1969 to 2019, in a way that you can follow really well how all these periods they evolved during the period of time. So yes, so from 2000 to 2010, so all of this influence from the hip hop and this new R&B, and from 2010 to 2009 we have exactly the same. So, and this is the reason that in this article from Matthias Mausch, he said that the really evolution point was in the 90s, when we had this revolution with the hip-hop influence, going more with beats and less with the use of harmonic and melodic instruments, and going more in this direction of using more beats, more effects in the songs. And at the same time, we have this strong influence from this contemporary R&B, that we have a lot of hip-hop together with electronic dance music, with as well with a little bit of soul, a little bit of blues. So this mix, I can say that this new or contemporary R&B is something important that started in the 90s, and we have still in these days and connected with these hip-hop beats. So if I can classify the music from 2010 for this moment, this is exactly what we have now. So we have in some ways the things that we took from the 90s, from the hip-hop, and the things that we took from this new or contemporary R&B, and we still use for today. Even that we can find out some differences among the singers, among the bands, we have a lot of similarities in the way that people they are singing, in the way that people they are playing the instruments. Perhaps what is new from 2000 until this moment that we didn't use too much in the previous years, that even that in this R&B with this new perspective, including many different elements from other genres, maybe the biggest difference that I can say is that from 2000 we had a lot of influence from the electronic dance music, from styles like house, like dubstep, trance music, for instance, or garage electronic music. So we had a lot of influence from this style. So maybe the biggest shift, it's not a revolution, but maybe one of the biggest shifts that we had in the last 10 years, that we have more influence from these sub-genres, from the electronic dance music, in the hip-hop, and in this contemporary contemporary rhythm and blues style. So this is the I can say one of the biggest revolutions in the last 10 years. So more influence of the electronic dance music in this kind of new R&B. So this is the way that we can perceive the music. Maybe one last thing to finish this video is that in the last maybe 3 years, yes, because since we had the influence of the song Despacito, I just want to check. No, because it was not 2 years, because this song was, yes, this song was popular in 2019. So yes, 1 year, 1.5 years in some ways, in terms of considering this, that we had a lot of influence of run style in the whole world in this style called reggaeton, or in Spanish, reggaeton. So this is a style, of course, an influence of Latin American music and hip hop, that we have this typical beat. In many different subgenres in different countries. And you know, since the song Despacito was so popular, other artists starting to use more this genre in other countries. And it's important to say as well that the reggaeton is the top one in all the different Latin American countries. So I did a small search in Spotify, just checking the top 10 in all the Latin American countries, and in all of them, with the exception of Brazil, because it's a different influence, because Brazil is more influenced by Portuguese culture. So in all of these countries, the top one was a reggaeton song. So it's important to know that even that we have all these things internationally, I think the reggaeton was one of the first genres with a really clear characteristic that started to influence music in different parts around the globe. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you can use this video for your proposals as a music therapist, and see you in another video. Thank you. If you're not part of this channel, please subscribe.